You're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast. We're an independent, general interest bookstore putting great reads in the hands of people in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hosted by resident Skylighters, we're here to bring you new and exciting author conversations, group reads, and bookseller chats. Happy listening.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Tyler Hobson and I'm a bookseller at SKYLIT Books here in Los Angeles, California. And welcome to the SKYLIT Book Podcast. Today we are joined by Clarence Lusane and Janell Hobson. Dr. Clarence Lusane is an author, activist, scholar, and journalist. He's a professor and former chairman of Howard University's Department of Political Science. Lusane earned his BA in communications from Wayne State University and both his master's and PhD from Howard University in political science. He's been a political consultant to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and a former commissioner for the DC Commission on African American Affairs. He frequently appears on MSNBC and C-SPAN and was invited by the Obamas to speak at the White House. Author of many books, including The Black History of the White House, Lusane lives and works in the Washington, D.C. area. Janell Hobson is a professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Albany. She is also director of both undergraduate studies and the honors program. She joined the core faculty shortly after receiving her PhD in women's studies at Emory University. Hobson has since devoted her research, teaching, and service to multiracial and transnational feminist issues in the discipline with a focus on representations in the histories of women in African diaspora. Hobson is the author of When God Lost Her Tongue, Historical Consciousness and the Black Feminist Imagination, Venus in the Dark, Blackness and Beauty in Popular Culture, and Bodies Evidence, Mediating Race, Globalizing Gender. She has also edited the volumes of Are All Women Still White?, Rethinking Race, Expanding Feminisms, and The Routledge Companion to Black Women's Cultural Histories. She is a contributing writer to Miss Magazine as well as various online platforms. She also guest edited special volumes on Harriet Tubman and slavery and popular culture. She was selected as a community fellow for 2021 and 22 at the University of Albany's Institute for History and Public Engagement, which supports her guest editing of the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project with Miss Magazine for the spring 2022 semester. Thank you both so much for joining us. You're by far the two most distinguished people I've ever gotten to introduce on this podcast. And I just wanted to quickly prompt both of you to do a little bit of a reading, if you'd like to share with the audience to kind of set the palette for what your conversation will be about. And then I'll let you two take it away.
The title of my book that's coming out right now is $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman and the ongoing struggle for racial justice and democracy. And what I try to do in this work is to recast to some degree Harriet Tubman, not as just someone who heroically rescued people individually, just through her own braving and daring during the slave era, but that the long arc of her life was really about her fight for democracy in a really broader context, not only for racial justice, but for women's rights, for suffrage, for the poor, for people who were ill and infirm. And so she lived to be 90, and her whole life should be looked at. But more generally, I think her contributions are telling for some of the issues we're dealing with today. So let me read a short passage that kind of links the then and now. Harriet Tubman never saw a full day of democracy. She spent her whole life under various forms of racial authoritarianism among millions of her fellow African Americans and other people of color. From birth in 1822 until 1849, when she escaped, she was enslaved in Maryland with little hope of being free, except by her own agency. From 1849 until the end of the Civil War and official end of slavery, she was a hunted fugitive. From 1865 to the late 1870s, Reconstruction softened but did not end Black marginalization and restrictions. And from 1877, when Reconstruction was overturned until her death in 1913, Jim Crow segregation constrained what she could do as a woman, an African American, and a member of the working class. I wanted to give that kind of perspective just to show that although she fought, she never saw a moment for democracy. The right for women to vote did not come until the 19th Amendment, 1920, 7 years after she died, and full voting for African Americans and others didn't come till the mid 1960s, and particularly with the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
All right, thank you for that. I will also offer a reading. This is an introduction to the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project that I guest edited with Ms. Magazine. I received support both from Ms. as well as my own university in working on this project. I have been doing some research on Harriet Tubman for some time. My very first approach to Harriet Tubman came in 2013 when I honored a different anniversary. Back then, it was the centennial anniversary of the date of her passing, which was on March 10th, 1913. So this year, 2022, is the bicentennial of her birth. And it was just really an exciting time to think about what she means for this country, as Clarence mentioned, what she means for democracy, what she means for the world. So the section that I'm going to read from my introduction is actually the concluding part, because I think it's quite appropriate to our conversation today. So this section is titled, "Her Freedom is Our Freedom." Born in either late February or early March in 1822, Harriet Tubman is the bridge between Black History and Women's History Months. She stood at the intersection of race and gender and ushered in freedom for all because her own freedom required it. As the Combahee River Collective, named for Tubman's leadership, assert in their Black feminist statement from 1977, and I quote, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression," unquote. Tubman understood this, which is why a week before her death, she delivered a message through Black suffragist Mary B. Talbot during the National Women's Suffrage March on March 3rd, 1913, quote, "Tell the women to stand together, for God will not forsake us," unquote. Unfortunately, many white suffragists chose racism and exclusion over unity. The radical Black feminists like Ida B. Wells Barnett, for example, defied such divisiveness by asserting their rightful place in the fight for voting rights, gender equality, and racial justice. These same Black women fought to keep alive Tubman's memory, from purchasing her headstone to resurrecting her name for civil rights and feminist movements, just as they fought to ensure this nation made democratic ideals a reality for all. In this milestone year of the 50th anniversary of Ms. Magazine, we salute a groundbreaking feminist and liberator who never lost sight of freedom. Not too invested in Mrs., as Andrea and Williams notes in an anecdote of Tubman's humorous dismissal of the title, Ms. Tubman will be remembered not merely by the name of her first husband, whom she left behind when she self-emancipated from slavery, but by the heroism she made synonymous with that name. She has stood the test of time through her incomparable example of bravery, fierceness, persistence, faith, self-assurance, compassion, and commitment to solidarity. May her memory serve as a guiding light, much like the North Star she followed, steering us all in the right direction at this critical juncture.
Oh, that was beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Your section was great
beautiful.
too.
So I love it. So I have so many questions for you.
Okay.
So the animating incident for my work was the decision by the Biden administration to replace Andrew Jackson on the front of the $20 bill with Harriet Tubman. The bills, the $5, $10, and $20 bills are being re-imaged because of security reasons. And there was a decision to take advantage of that to change the images. And after a process, there was a decision to have Harriet Tubman on the front. They still want to have Andrew Jackson on the back. That's a whole other issue to deal with. But it's not universally accepted. There are, there are clearly millions of people, particularly African Americans, particularly African American women, who like the idea, but there are others who don't. So, what's your kind of read, and how do you sort of think about that as honor or exploitation or something in between, or both, or neither?
I think it's such a great, and I'm so glad your book is coming out on this issue, because I think it opens up a lot of really interesting issues that we can discuss about Harriet Tubman and her legacy. So from my own perspective, I was elated when Harriet Tubman was chosen. Well, for two reasons. One, I was aware, that the Women Under 20 was a grassroots campaign. So it was regular women, specifically Barbara Howard comes to mind as one of the co-founders of the Women on the 20 movement, who decided that, if we're going to honor, because they started out with just wanting to honor the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which was back in 2020. And they thought it would be great to honor that centennial with something substantive, like having women on our currency, because we don't really have, other than those special commemorative coins, we don't really have women on our currency. So they just thought something tangible rather than just a statue or a monument might go a long way to being able to preserve women's history in the national consciousness. So I understand where that comes from. But I thought what was really ingenious of that particular campaign is the way that they opened it up as a democratic process. They actually invited the public to vote on what historical woman should we place if we were to replace the $20. And the $20 seemed like an appropriate currency. It's the most used paper currency. And also there's that dicey history with Andrew Jackson that not everyone is, finds heroic, given his history of the Indian Removal Act and slavery and that sort of thing. So I like where it came from. And when they did open it up for a Democratic vote, Harriet Tubman won. So that's what I was pleasantly surprised, that she was the one who received the most votes. She received more votes than Eleanor Roosevelt, more votes than Rosa Parks, more votes than Susan B. Anthony. So that means something in terms of her popularity. And then when the Obama administration turned around and basically validated that popular vote by deciding to make it official, I thought that was great. So I think the conversations that came up, usually on social media, that's where a lot of these debates happen. I don't think the people who opposed, and I'm not talking about like conservative right wings who were going to be having issues with a Black woman on our money, but the actual progressive fellow Black women, I know two in particular, who are very adamant that she not be on the $20 bill. I also know that those, because I know them personally, I'm not going to name names, but I also know that they were unaware of the grassroots campaign. They had assumed, I think, that the selection of Harriet Tubman came from top, not from the bottom up. They thought it was a top-down decision. And I think they thought that was misguided. I mean, it's also possible once they've learned that it really was a grassroots bottom-up movement, that they probably still think that the movement was misguided because of the arguments that they made about, exploitation and commercialism, which I find very problematic, that they would immediately assume that having the likeness of Harriet Tubman on our currency immediately devalues her somehow, because we did not have that. We just don't. We don't make that argument about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Not at all. We realize they're on on the currency because they represent the country, just like with the UK is going through the changing of their currency now that they have a king
Right.
instead of a queen.
Right.
That's not commercializing. It's just it's like the symbolic weight of who they are. So being able to recognize Harriet Tubman for the symbolic meaning of who she is what I see is important. Now, yes, it's problematic that she comes from a legacy of slavery, which is based on the commercial exploitation of Black people, enslaved Black people. But I think it is precisely because Harriet Tubman had worked so long in her years trying to get paid, first of all, trying to get paid. Even when she was enslaved, she was negotiating wages with her enslaver. But she had an eye towards freedom, which means that I think she'd be proud, that she'd be recognized in this way.
Oh no, I thought that's really, really helpful and insightful. I give a whole chapter to the opposing views or contrasting views because let everybody's voice ring. And we do have to be sensitive to exploitation and performative anti-racism and all of those kind of deals. But you're right that this is a movement from below. And it's a movement with a long history that it didn't just start with the Obama administration, but we can trace it back to the 60s at least, and even before then in terms of the issue around race. But for women, all the way back to the 1920s, there were rumblings about why is only old white men on these on the currency. So, but it's a narrative, right? And narrative comes in many, many different forms, many of which we do not pay attention to.
Yes.
And so one of them we have is who's on the currency.
Yes.
Exactly. And Native Americans, there are some Native Americans that will not touch a 20 because of Andrew Jackson. And as you pointed out, his history of being a slave owner and a trader, but personally involved in massacres. It wasn't just orders; he was there, engaging, and so he should never been honored by anybody. But it's a statement from the country of whose history, whose story, whose narrative is important and who's not. And so I, see it in that light, and then just sort of the sweet irony, as you point out, that Harriet Tubman fought for decades, really, for a just pension that she deserved for her work during the Civil War. Pensions were given to Confederate soldiers who had rebelled to overthrow the country. They didn't want to give Harriet Tubman one. She finally did, and it turns out, it was $20 a month. So
exactly the irony.
That's, the arc of the universe and all that coming together. But what the other thing I was really just trying to do was, what we can learn from Harriet Tubman relative to the issues that we face today. And that we have to consistently bring a historic and broad perspective when we're looking at whether it's healthcare, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's voting rights. None of this started like a year ago or 2020, right? There's a long, long history, and only understanding that history can, you really fashion public policy and organize to try to meet some of those needs.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why your book is so important, because it really gets us into thinking about what those histories mean, what are the symbolisms that are important to us, and even how we have these different approaches and different interpretations, right? I'm actually reminded of, because in my bicentennial project, I included a number of guest authors who wrote about different aspects of Harriet Tubman's life to really humanize her. And out of that humanizing, I was able to have some conversations with the descendants of Harriet Tubman, and quite a few of them are very much on board with wanting to see her on the journey. Some of them who are very elderly are hoping that they'll still be alive when it actually comes out. One of them, Judith G. Bryan, was her reason for wanting to see Harriet Tubman on the 20 had a lot to do with she really feels that everyday usage of money just seeps into our consciousness, our subconscious, so that she's always going to be there as part of the fabric of our society. And I think that is where I see the value, more than any kind of she doesn't belong on the money because we're not to be fetishized or objectified or whatever it is that people are thinking in that argument.
Can you imagine that all these people who are fighting against 1619 Project and critical race theory, what they're going to do when they got that $20 bill coming out of the ATM machine?
Oh my goodness.
And Harriet Tubman looking up at them.
Make them feel all guilty. They'll want to give that money. Maybe they'll give it to reparations.
And maybe they're reparation that money. Yeah, I doubt that. But,
I know.
But that moment alone.
Well, that's the thing. Once it's in your face, it's like, oh yeah, we owe this woman money, don't we?
Right.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's we got to change these narratives.
Yeah.
And and then once you kind of can't go back. I might get in trouble in the book because I talk about my high school, and I went to a really famous high school in Detroit, Cass Tech, which for generations, it put out the best students and all of that. And, we all came out, were progressive and activists and all that. But did not know that the school was I knew the school was named after a former governor, but did not know that governor had been in Andrew Jackson's administration and had been one of the key architects around the Indian Removal Act and all kind of other horrible things. So as much as I love my high school and it's an icon, I joined the voices of folks who have stated that they need to change the name.
Yes.
Right, because once you can't claim ignorance anymore. Once you know.
Oh, absolutely. Which is interesting because I'm a little ambivalent about changing names and removing statues. I'm more about adding statues and adding names. That's just me. And that's mostly because I think that we are very, as a nation, as a country, we're very ahistorical. And when we work towards removing, certain historical narratives, it's very easy to forget, all the parts that come together. So I mean, I'm not losing sleep over Robert E. Lee being removed, as a Confederate statue. But I also know that I would have preferred to see more of an erection of other types of statues, that populated the parks and our public sphere. Because, for example, I think even in New York City, I think was it in City Hall or somewhere, there was some debate where they wanted to remove Thomas Jefferson because he was a slaveholder, for example. And I'm like, once you start removing Thomas Jefferson, as problematic as he is, then you start removing all the other stories that are told about him. Because you remove Thomas Jefferson, then that removes our ability to talk about Sally Hemings and her children. It's like we start chipping away, like, no, we can't recognize our founding fathers. It's like, they're complicated. Let's have a nuanced history that you can still have your statues to Thomas Jefferson because he did write the Declaration of Independence, and it was influential, and it was integral to the founding of an idea about what this country is. But it's like, don't remove his statue, add Sally Hemings' statue.
Right, right.
You know, that's what I'm thinking.
Right.
You don't just remove all of that and then it's like, okay, we don't need to think about slavery. We don't need to think of, no, we need to be upfront and honest with that history. And in a way, you know, as much as I agree with everyone that we need to remove Andrew Jackson, I'm not as perturbed if he remains on the back of the currency while Harriet is on the front, because it's like, well, get thee behind me is what I'm thinking that. And also, I really think Andrew Jackson and Harriet Tubman, they are flip sides of this history. I mean,
they are.
Yep. You know, there is the heroic liberation story that Harriet Tubman represents, and then there's all of that oppression that Andrew Jackson represents.
Right.
You know,
well,
but,
you know,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. No, I'm going to say, you know, picking up what you're saying, the thing I find rewarding, maybe this is our scholar's hat, is that these changes open up discussions.
Yes.
So whether people agree or disagree, you have to be part of the discussion.
Yeah.
And can't kind of blissfully sort of ignore, you know, that there's a history that has to be confronted somehow. And that the only way you kind of get past it is through this confrontation. And then it really depends a lot on the process. So in Washington, D.C., the mayors started a process where they went through and reviewed every street name, school name, building name in the city and came up with categories of whether they were human rights violators, enslavers, Confederates, and whatever. And it was, of course, hundreds of names. And then they boiled down to, you know, which ones should be changed, which ones should remain, which ones should be adjusted in some kind of way. So I thought it was a really sort of thoughtful and reflective process as opposed to just reactive. And so my son's high school was named after Woodrow Wilson. And as it turns out, of course, Woodrow Wilson was, you know, awful on issues of race. And so they're like, yeah, we got to change the name on that one. But they left others, like there's some stuff to Jefferson, to Lincoln. You know, I live on Madison Street, you know, so they, you know, they weren't changing everything. You know,
no. And yes, I know, because somebody wanted to cancel Lincoln too. It's like, he's problematic, but he did issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, Lincoln transformed. You know, he went from A to somewhere else.
Exactly, and that's what I mean about, you know, we need nuance, because if we're going to be like, oh, we can't have this because these people were horrible back then.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. Next thing you know, we'll be like, we can't honor Martin Luther King because he was a womanizer. I mean, come on. Right. We don't even know if there's a Me Too story in there. So anyway, I'm just saying.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like, we need to be careful with that, because, you know, we're going for I don't want to say perfectionism, but we are moving in that direction of, you have to be, you know, absolutely, you know, unblemished, and people are just not like that. It's just, history is just a lot more complicated than that.
Well, it's challenging times, because then on the other side, if you look at, you know, Florida and Texas and places, and you know, all these bills they pass around the country at these school boards. With more to come, you know, there is, you know, we will have a generation where somehow they were talking about slavery and not racism. If they talk about slavery at all.
Well, and that's the issue too, because I mean, that pushing for critical race theory, which came in response to 1619 Project, it came in response to Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. It was a pushback to the kind of racial justice that we were seeking. I mean, so this, to me, that's a tit for tat in a way, because you know, we were pushing towards, let's be open, let's be honest, let's be conscious, and let's raise awareness around the ways in which our history is mired in this oppression, as much as we like to tout its democracy and freedom.
Right.
But then the flip side of that is like, then we can't talk about any of it, because that backlash is all about, all the folks who wanted to, let's topple the statues. It's one thing to say topple the statues of the Confederates, because they were committing treason. Let's be
For real.
But I'm just like, do we have to also topple the statues of the ones we call the founding fathers too? I think that's where, people are like, wait a minute. So that, believe it or not, on the other side, the other political side, they see that as extreme as folks saying we can't talk about slavery. And this is why I'm like, I like nuance and I like balance. And I never saw, for example, with the 1619 Project, I saw that as an invitation, really, to rethink what is the significance of slavery to this country. People immediately turned it into this political piece, and I suppose it is, because it is advocating that we place slavery at the center of the origin story of America. Lots of people are uncomfortable with that, and so it pushed the right kinds of envelopes, because we do need to have those conversations. But at the same time, I also know that there were many historians who felt that it did not really represent the full history, the full truth, and that also needs to be addressed as well.
But so to me, the history, the anti-history is so pervasive and growing, because most folks not only never heard of critical race theory, absolutely, most folks never heard of 1619.
Yeah, that's true.
However you interpret it, people had not even heard of, it was just not in, it's not taught. I teach at a HBCU, and I have, Black students, and most of them had not heard of 1619 until, it really became more controversial. So, it's this sort of absence of history, because there can be conservative views of history and progressive views of history. But the no history at all crowd is really what's trying to, what's really kind of out there. And, to me, it's a really dangerous moment, because it's very much tied to what I think is the authoritarian move, which only can occur or occurs when people are ignorant.
Yes.
And you whip people up around, some fantasized theories and concepts, and then that allows for creating all kinds of policy, undemocratic policies, and laws, which is where a significant part of the country is at right now.
Yeah. And how widespread do you think that is? I know that we see that in some of the more conservative states, but I also wonder, has there been enough progress where you're seeing that we're having more conversations about race? Because this is just, again, if you know your history, this is typical of how we've been behaving. It's always been progress, then backlash, progress and backlash, progress and backlash. That's what we're dealing with. There was some progress that was made from the 1619 Project to Black Lives Matter over George Floyd, and people reading books about anti-racism and that sort of thing. Even with the success of movies like Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, shows that as a culture we are opening up to more diverse narratives and more diverse people. But then, of course, with that comes this backlash of wanting to reassert white supremacy, to be against this kind of diversity and pluralism that unseats the power of white privilege and white power.
So I think there is a majority in the country for democracy
Mm-hmm.
and for some notions of inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a significant organized minority
Mm-hmm.
that is on the move,
Yes.
and it has resources
Mm-hmm.
that include uh, billionaire donors,
Mm-hmm.
conservative media,
Yes.
elected officials,
Mm-hmm.
and significantly now,
Mm-hmm.
uh, many in the judiciary, including the Supreme Court.
Yes. Yes.
And that's where we have limited capacity to have checks and balance.
Mm-hmm.
And with the 6-3 majority,
Mm-hmm.
it is pretty clear they're going to take advantage of this moment.
Yes.
And it will not just stop with Dobbs,
Mm-hmm.
but they're going to go after, as you point out, many of these gains that were made
Yes.
from the New Deal to the Great Society
Mm-hmm.
that they've been pushing back or trying to get rid of for decades now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my biggest concern, because I think that the sentiment in the country is not towards that,
Mm-hmm.
but a smaller organized minority
Mm-hmm.
can go pretty far if it's a disorganized majority.
Mm-hmm.
And we are not, and I think the Democratic Party is a little late to the game
Yes.
on this rising authoritarianism, and that the Republican Party is not, 2022 is not the Republican Party even of Reagan,
Mm-hmm.
in that, these extremists have really are at the core at every level, not just in Congress where a lot of attention is given, but in these states where you look at Texas, you look at Florida, you look at Mississippi, you look at Utah, state after state where these guys have gotten disproportionate power. They have used it in undemocratic ways, going after basically working people, working people of all races. And so that's why I'm really concerned that the response hasn't been as robust as it needs to be. These folks are not going away.
No, they're not going away. And that's why history is important and why they want to control history. Because,
Right.
because, as Gerda Lerner, feminist historian, once said, history to those in power, history has always mattered. Because, history can reinforce your power or not. And it's like if you can control the narrative that you've always been in power and that your people were always in power, that your culture is the only one that matters, then that just reinforces the power that you have now versus those who can contest that and say no. I'm actually thinking when you're talking about what we're dealing with, and it's like, yeah, who from the past can we learn from? And I immediately went to the women of the National Association of Colored Women, featuring Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett, that particular cohort. Harriet Tubman was at the founding convention of that too. So she's like an elder to this group as they're dealing with these issues, because it's like if we can put ourselves into their footsteps, into their minds, it's like that was the generation that saw the emancipation. They saw the end of slavery, and they were part of that movement to get educated, to rise up, and to be free Black people. And that generation went from the jubilee of freedom to the institutionalization of Jim Crow in 1896. And so they already saw how you can have these hard-won rights stripped away from you. So I think it would behoove us to know that particular history and to go back to that particular moment of the Anna Julia Coopers and the Ida B. Wells and the W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, because they were dealing with that. They were dealing with, we were up from slavery and now we got this setback, and what do we do to keep moving?
Yeah. Yeah. I know you teach it as well.
Yes.
These are really eye-opening for, I know my students, I'm sure your students as well, because they're not getting it at an earlier level.
No, they're always telling me, like, this is the first time hearing this, and this is the first time hearing that.
Right.
Even something like the date 1619, my students didn't even know that slavery took place before that date.
Right.
So it's like, yep, there's a lot more to learn. So, which is interesting because, once they realize that, wow, I didn't know all this stuff, and then they get angry that they didn't learn this earlier. So it's like, was I duped? It's like, oh, you were only getting, just a half bit, of information.
Yeah, they get this kind of hero history.
Yes.
That, they're individuals who all along sort of saved the world or were villains or whatever.
Yes.
And so, I teach Reconstruction because, at one point I remember one class I talked about Reconstruction. Virtually 90% of the class had never heard of the term.
Yeah,
they were like, we don't know what that is.
Yeah.
And I was like, so you know what? This is not your fault, right?
Yes, exactly.
This is not your fault. This is how we don't educate. So we're gonna talk about this.
Oh yeah, exactly. I always say, well, now you're going to learn.
Right.
Now you're here to learn. And speaking of hero history, I think that was what was so useful in doing the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project this year, because there really is just this very flat narrative about who Harriet Tubman was. She freed the slaves, and that's about all folks know. I didn't realize that she lived to be 91 years old, that she not only, went back, 13 times to free 70 folk, but she was also freeing people during the Civil War. She was, opening up a home for aged people. I mean, she was pretty busy doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, just so multifaceted.
Yeah, that's the main thing I hope coming out of my book is that people start to see her in her entire life.
Yes.
And then again, where she came from to where she ended is just such a remarkable story.
Yeah.
And that I write about she had this disability, because she was injured when she was doing slavery. So she did all of this. She was having seizures and, all kinds of problems.
I know. My students are always amazed by that when it's like they didn't realize she was disabled.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed working on this because it really made me read Harriet Tubman in ways that I just kind of skimmed over, like probably most people had. And I'm the better for it. I absolutely love finding out, her life kind of throughout, and I just sort of devoured all these books about her.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm hoping to embark on a larger project now that I've done the Bicentennial Project. I everyone is like, it's time for you to do the biography.
Well, thank you for doing that, because it was a very, very wonderful array of voices and perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your book. I think, as I said, I like the way you were able to put that whole debate into this larger perspective and this historical and contemporary context. Really important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much.
He's joined us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Well, what a lovely chat. That was phenomenal. I'm so glad I got to be here to hear it first. As always, such a wonderful chat. And I would just recommend to all listeners, $20 and change by Clarence. Dr. Lusane will be available at the SKYLIT Books. It's going to be at our main location at 1818 Vermont. So stop by and grab it whenever you can get the chance. And thank you both again so much for joining us. That was lovely. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and holidays.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Nice meeting you.
Well, have a great day.
All right, nice, wonderful meeting you, Janell.
Yeah, take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Happy
Bye-bye.
Thanksgiving. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.